Müllerin, a cycle of songs composed by Franz Schubert to text by Wilhelm Müller, to be performed this evening by the wonderful duo baritone Gerald Finley and pianist Julius Drake. Today's talk will take us through three topics: the poetry, the composition, and the music. We'll begin with the poetry. There's some disagreement among historians about the origin of the story that became these poems, but Giovanni Paisiello composed an opera titled L'amore contrastato osa la Molinara, The Thwarted Love or the Miller Girl, which premiered in Naples in 1789 before touring Germany under the title Die schöne Müllerin, The Beautiful Maid of the Mill. Paisiello's work became a great influence to both the literature and music in Germany and Austria at the time. In 1795, Beethoven used two arias from this opera as the basis for piano variations, and poets Goethe, Rückert, and Müller all wrote poetry loosely based on the plot of the opera. The poetry that became Die schöne Müllerin originated as a sort of collaborative play written by a group of poets who met regularly at the home of Friedrich August von Stagemann, a Prussian politician who was an amateur poet who was deeply interested in keeping alive old German cultural traditions. Each poet in this group wrote poems from a single character's point of view. Müller, fitting his name, wrote and played the miller in this play, and as such, he poured his likeness into the character. At the time, he was desperately in love with Louise Hensel, just as the young miller, the protagonist of the story, is in love with the maid. Of her, Müller wrote, "Whatever I have done, thought, felt, spoken, or created that is good and beautiful, I have created, spoken, and felt through you. I have you to thank for eternal blessedness, you alone, and perhaps also for transitory earthly blessedness as well." Müller's experience of unrequited love became the central theme to both Die schöne Müllerin and Die Winterreise, Müller's two most famous poetry cycles, both of which were ultimately set to music by Franz Schubert. This play created by Müller and his peers did not survive, and little is known about his performance, but composer Ludwig Berger, who was composing music for this play, noticed the exceptionality of the poetry that Müller had been writing and convinced him to expand on those ideas, which ultimately led Müller to write a complete cycle of 25 poems that became Die schöne Müllerin, published in 1821 as part of a larger collection. Berger ultimately wrote 10 songs, 5 of which were to Müller's text. Müller, for his part, loved when his poetry was set to music, expressing that it was his desire that composers take up his text. He wrote in his diary, "If I could produce the melodies, my songs would be more pleasing than they are now. Perhaps there is a kindred spirit somewhere who will hear the tunes behind the words and give them back to me." He got his wish, as his poetry was frequently set to music by dozens of prolific composers, including Brahms, Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel, Meyerbeer, Carl Loewe, and of course, Franz Schubert. Now we will move on to discuss the composition. By the time Schubert composed Die schöne Müllerin in 1823, he was already a well-renowned composer within Vienna, having composed in a wide range of genres, from piano solos to symphonies and operas. He was already particularly well known for his lieder, having started composing songs at the age of 14. His songs had already begun to advance musical concepts and ideas that became emblematic of the Romantic movement, such as the growing importance of melody, the use of longer and more defined melodies, and the use of melodic textures to imitate real sounds, which Schubert employed extensively throughout his lieder, in such cases as the spinning wheel in Gretchen am Spinnrade, the pounding of horse hooves in Erlkönig, and water flowing in a brook, which we will see used throughout Die schöne Müllerin. Romantic elements, especially the importance of nature, also appear pervasively in the subject matter of Schubert's music, as he often used Romantic poetry as the text setting to his vocal music. In Die schöne Müllerin, we will see the importance of nature to the story arc, with personification of the brook, repeated imagery of flowers, stones, and water, and extensive use of symbolism. How Schubert first became acquainted with Müller's poetry is also a bit of a disagreement among historians. It is possible that Schubert saw Paisiello's opera, which was performed in Vienna in 1822 while Schubert was living there, but there's little historical evidence either way. The early Schubert biographer, Heinrich Kreisel von Hellborn, recounts an anecdote told to him by Schubert's long-term friend and fellow composer, Benedict Randhartinger, in which he explains that Schubert first came across the collection on Randhartinger's desk, from which he borrowed the book overnight and returned the next day with the first few songs in the cycle already completed. However, Randhartinger often over-embellished his stories of Schubert as he retold them later through his life. He told several different versions of this particular story over the years, repeatedly changing and mistaking the details. Musicologist Susan Ewens offers the possibility that Carl Maria von Weber may have introduced Schubert to Müller's poetry on a visit to Vienna in 1822, but other than circumstantial evidence, there is little evidence to support this theory. The time frame and conditions under which Schubert composed this song cycle are also a bit mysterious. The only surviving original autograph is of a single song, number 15, Eifersucht und Stolz, dated 1823, October 1823. Schubert also indicated in a letter to Franz Schubert, dated the 30th of November 1823, that I have composed nothing since the opera, Fire Obras, except a few mill songs. Fire Obras was completed from May to October of that year. This could indicate that Schubert completed the cycle in October and November of 1823, but it gives no indication as to when he began the cycle. There are also several gaps in Schubert's life during 1823, during which no surviving letters or compositions exist. However, it is clear that Schubert composed Die schöne Müllerin at a turning point in his life. A disease, likely syphilis, that would ultimately cause his death began to severely impact the composer's health during 1823, and he spent much of the year in the hospital, which explains the gaps in surviving documents. Additionally, Franz Schubert and Joseph von Spahn, both long-term friends of Schubert's, wrote in their memoirs that Schubert composed some of the cycle while in the hospital, but with no mention of the dates of his hospitalization. Schubert mentions in a letter dated the 28th of February, 1823, that the circumstances of my health still do not permit me to leave the house, which is the earliest that he mentions his illness. By the 31st of March, 1824, Schubert was fully aware of the terminality of his disease, mentioning in another letter, imagine a man whose health will never be right again, and who in sheer despair over this ever makes things worse and worse. Imagine a man whose most brilliant hopes have perished. It is clear that the songs in Die schöne Müllerin were among the first composed by Schubert under the specter of his impending death. Heinrich Kreisel von Hellborn argued that in Die schöne Müllerin, for the first time in any song cycle, each song was created independently with its own character and expression separate from the entire cycle, though within the cycle, the songs do belong together. He argued that of Schubert's Müllerlieder, each number is complete in and of itself, the master with true poetical conception being intent on giving exhaustively to every song an appropriate form and character, although each lead forms a part of the whole and has therefore true signification of its own. It is surprising to note, however, that the first complete performance of the song cycle in concert was on the 6th of May, 1856, 32 years after the publication of the songs, given by the famous singer Julius Stockhausen. For most of the 19th century, it was customary in Vienna for vocal concerts to be performed with a mix of song, ballads, and arias. Though the concept of a song cycle was now about 4 decades old, the first song cycle generally considered to be An die Ferne Geliebte, written by Beethoven in April 1816, the concept of performing the complete cycle in a single performance was new. As music critic Edward Hanslick wrote, Stockhausen bade farewell to the public with what is truly the simplest program in the world. Instead of the usual omnium gatherum of pieces that do not belong together and have nothing to do with one another, we read on the announcement only Die schöne Müllerin, a song cycle by Franz Schubert. The idea is, to our knowledge, a new one. This is quite interesting given how popular standalone performances of complete song cycles are today. Stockhausen went on to perform the complete cycle across Europe, accompanied on several occasions by Johannes Brahms. Now we will continue with a brief overview of the music of Die schöne Müllerin. The narrative of the song cycle follows the journey of a young miller through nature, his encounter with and unrequited love for a young mill maiden, and his ultimate despair and death. Throughout the following discussion, I would like to draw particular attention to the imagery and symbolism, the tempo, form, and tonality used by Schubert. The cycle begins with the miller singing about his desire to travel and the inherent call of nature for all things to wander. Not just the miller, but also the water, the mill wheels, even the stones are called by nature to go on a journey. The miller marvels at the wonders that wandering allows him to experience. Susan Ewens explains that implicit in his song is his belief that only to those who roam are the beauty and beauties of life and the secrets of the world revealed. The strophic and repetitive versing of the first song, Das Wandern, helps the audience to get into the mindset of the miller, as the short tune that he repeats to himself fits the pacing of his gait as he hikes along the brook. A continuing rhythmic theme of repeated semiquavers used to imitate flowing water, paired with upbeat tempos and major keys, help create the atmosphere of excitement about embarking on this journey through nature. This gives the journey a sense of inevitability. Just as the water is destined to flow through the brook, the wanderer is destined to tread his own journey. In many ways, the first three songs serve as a sort of microcosm of the cycle as a whole. The miller's excitement to be out in nature, paralleling his obsession with the millmaid, and his disillusionment with the brook, paralleling his unrequited love. Pay attention to the pacing of songs 4 through 7, as we now alternate between slow and fast tempos. The miller gives thanks to the stream in our first langsam tempos of the cycle. Time seems to slow down when the miller first lays eyes on the beautiful maid of the mill house, but his obsession with the maiden sets in almost immediately, and we are plunged into a fast and frantic tempo with our first minor song of the piece, in which the miller fantasizes about all the things that he would do for the maiden were he stronger, and he rues his own physical weakness. As we return again to a langsam tempo, the miller second guesses the stream, wondering whether he has been led astray and reminiscing on what could have been, or perhaps could be, were the maiden to return his love. And then we go back again to an etwas geschwind tempo, as the miller frantically and hastily imagines all of the fantastical things he must accomplish in order to win the love of the maid. The following group of songs, 8 through 11, reiterate much of the imagery of nature first introduced at the start of the cycle, as the miller finally gathers the courage to introduce himself to the millmaid and is taken aback that she doesn't instantly fall in love with him. However, the imagery in the text, the mäßig tempo, and the simple brightness of the music in major key give the listener the impression that this meeting between the miller and the millmaid is imagined. We are not witnessing a first meeting between two young lovers, but rather a single young man slowly losing his mind to obsession. The text repeats the imagery of the flowers in the forest, the brook, the stones, and the mill wheel, and the moon and stars in a blue sky reflecting in the maiden's blue eyes. Susan Ewens suggests that the miller repeatedly seeks a romantic alliance with nature, in which the symbolic relationship of the brook and its flowers signifies the intimacy that he desires with the maid. As the flowers both appear with the miller and the millmaid, the miller imagines that they are used to convey messages of love between the two. Here too, the miller begins to claim possession of the maid, referring to the flowers that shine in her eyes as his own flowers. This foreshadows the growing obsession with possessing the millmaid throughout the rest of the cycle, especially its crescendo in the 11th song, Mine, which means mine in English. Here he beseeches the brook, the mills, the forest birds to spread the word that the millmaid is his own. Then he challenges the sun to produce a brighter shine, or springtime to produce more beautiful flowers than she is. The repeated figure of quavers in the piano part and the quick flowing text give the song a rushed excitement, while the harmonic changes and semitone progression of the word unverstanden, uncomprehended, give attention to the miller's emotions, as though he is not very secure in his possession of the maid, but he has tricked himself into believing that she is his. As there has been no indication whatsoever of reciprocated love, the miller is either delusional or has misinterpreted some minor interaction he has had with the maiden. Mine can also be considered a sort of Act 1 finale of the song cycle. We then have a metaphorical intermission, a literal hiatus from the action and plot of the cycle, with the song Pause, which means pause, as the poet laments the pain and sorrow that he has put into these poems. As he rests here, he ponders what is to come. The rhythmic consistency in the accompaniment is reminiscent of a march, and it gives the song a sense of impending future that cannot be halted. Through the same rhythmic texture, the tonality switches between major and minor, giving a sense that the song divides the excitement of the miller's journey up to this point from the spiral into depression and the tragedy that is to come. Here too, we are introduced to a new symbol, the green ribbon attached to the miller's lute. Pay attention to the symbolism of the color green throughout the rest of the cycle. The next group of songs quickly brings about the miller's reconciliation with reality. As the miller's idealized fantasies of the world come crashing down around him, we reach the darkest turns for the miller, depicted in 3 consecutive songs in minor key, songs 14 through 16. The hunter arrives, much to the chagrin of the miller, who frantically attempts to ward him off so as not to upset the millmaid, but the miller already knows that he himself cannot compete with the hunter for the maiden's affections, and the maid runs away with the hunter. With jealousy and pride, the miller angrily commands the stream to chase the hunter away and scold the maiden for her fickleness. This is the first time in the cycle that the miller has seen any aspect of nature as an enemy. Until now, he has only considered the stream an ally and companion. The song only switches to a major tonality when the miller asks the stream to lie about his sad face and tell the maid that he is happily making music without her on the banks of the brook. At this point, the miller declares that his favorite color is green, which he knows to be the maiden's favorite color, but the green no longer symbolizes the music of the lute, nor the bravery of the hunter, which are the aspects of green that the maiden loves. But rather, green now represents the grasses of the cypress grove that will cover the miller when he dies. The miller quickly switches and scorns the color green for being such an evil and hateful color. He pours out his hatred and anger for green and his disdain for the maiden's decision in the final Geschwind piece of the cycle. Now we reach the final songs of the cycle. The miller laments that all the flowers and green of nature could not make the maiden love him, nor can they make his life worth living again. But his death can have purpose, in that his grave will allow flowers and grasses to grow anew in the spring. Notice here we have a figure of repeated dotted rhythms and the long psalm tempo, which give a sense of finality to the miller's wandering, while alterations in between major and minor tonality provide a contrast between the images of life and death. Here we witness a conversation between the miller and the brook. The images of nature and the brook's description of life are depicted in a major key, while the miller sings only in minor, even when he sings about life. The miller has resolved that his life is no longer viable to live because of his broken heart. The brook symbolizes the hope and excitement of life, just as it did at the beginning of the cycle, but to the miller, the brook now only represents a cool and eternal resting place. The brook rises to the occasion and resolves to provide the greatest resting place for the miller, keeping him cool and comfortable, roaring when the hunter comes so that the miller cannot hear his horn sounds, and covering his eyes when the millmaid is near so that he cannot see her. The simple and calm texture of the accompaniment provide a perfect lullaby to comfort the miller at the end of his journey. Graham Johnson argues that Die schöne Müllerin was a work that changed Schubert on a deeply spiritual level, splitting Schubert's life and work into before and after categories. The 5 years between the composition of Die schöne Müllerin and Schubert's death were perhaps the most compositionally rich of his life, perhaps due to the knowledge of his pending mortality, or perhaps because of the spiritual healing that he experienced in writing these mill songs. To conclude, we have discussed a bit about the lives of Wilhelm Müller, the poet, and Franz Schubert, the composer, to give context to the writing of this poetry and the composition of the song cycle. And we've talked through the narrative of the cycle and how imagery, symbolism, and musical concepts are used throughout the cycle. I hope that learning more about the poet, the composer, and the music has provided some insights that will amplify your enjoyment of the wonderful concert this evening. Thank you for coming.